Thank you for tuning in for this next installment of Black and Bold Perspectives on Leadership. I am Makia Moody, and I am thrilled to have this conversation today with Saida Agostini. Hey, girl.
Hey.
How are you finding 2020?
I feel like that's a loaded question these days, but I'm just trying to get through like so many of us and take the lessons that I can. How about you?
I am navigating. I feel like with each week, I'm learning something new or being stretched in a different way. And so I'm trying to remain optimistic about beginning again from scorched earth in
Mm,
many places. But
mm.
I am so excited to have this conversation with you because you are such a phenomenal woman. And so I'm
Aw.
excited to just hear more about your life journey and your leadership experiences. And so I've got a couple of questions for you, and I'm sure that our viewers are going to be dazzled by the wisdom and the insights that you share. And so the first question is about legacy. We come
Mhm.
from a strong and resilient lineage. I'm curious about how you would describe the type of ancestor that you want to be and why.
So, I've been thinking about this a lot, right? Because it's always interesting because we usually ask folks to kind of talk about like who is the ancestor that we look up to, who are the elders that we connect with, as opposed to like kind of really thinking about ourselves as ancestors. And I think there's something really beautiful about that, right? In terms of thinking about the reality that in this moment, like we have a legacy to give other people behind us. And so when I think about kind of the ancestor that I want to be, what I hope and I pray for is that I am someone who, in my practice and how I live my life, I create a model of someone who is really about not just kind of fighting for pleasure or fighting for a different kind of world for the future, but claiming that as something that's necessary and needed right now. And that's something that's a birthright, right? Because I think a big tradition kind of in mainstream discourses around Blackness and women and queerness is that we have to, we get our freedom after we die, or our freedoms are for future generations. And that's not enough. We have to know that today we can practice freedom and liberation. And that's what I want for myself. And that's what I want for my future generations, whoever they are, my nieces, my nibblings, my own children. I want them to be like, no, we're fighting for our future, but we're also fighting for ourselves.
Wow, that is so poignant. I feel like you just called in James Baldwin to our conversation. I have
Take
his
that
quote,
any day.
right? I have his quote about how long do you want me to wait for your progress? And
Mm,
so I've received your gift of that, I guess that mantra, specifically for this moment in time that we are navigating. So I'm curious, you have had so many experiences personally, professionally. You are quite the eclectic woman based on your social media feeds. I know you have a lot of creative endeavors and pursuits. If there was a soundtrack of greatest hits related to your career, what songs would make the track list?
So I think right now, like what comes to top of mind is The Makings of You, but the live version by Curtis Mayfield, right? And I would also probably add D'Angelo's Africa, and of course, Aretha Franklin's Sparkle. I feel like that would really be the trio of songs, And I think it's because one, I mean, they're all rooted in such like this beautiful tradition of like love and tenderness, right? Like if you listen to those songs, like, I mean, especially when you listen to Sparkle by Aretha Franklin, I'm not going to break down Sparkle the way I usually would do if I'm in my bathroom, right? But when you listen to Aretha Franklin's Sparkle, what you hear is someone I feel like who is reveling in herself, and the joy that she brings, right? Like, I think so often we're taught, particularly as Black women, to be shy about our beauty and to be humble about like what it is we bring into the world. And that's something that I struggle with for myself, right? And I find that the moments in which I feel like my most powerful and the most strong, the strongest in myself, is when I don't hesitate to claim my beauty and my strength and my intelligence, right? And so that's why that those particular songs like really feel like my soundtrack.
Awesome. I love that question in these interviews because then there's always songs that I need to add to my playlist to be sure that, like, obviously I'm missing out on something by not knowing Aretha Franklin's Sparkle. And so I need to get that
It's
in my
a
life.
jam. It's a jam. And there should be a Black and Bold playlist. I would listen to it.
You know, you may have just spoken something into existence, Saida. I'll make note of that for 2021. Music is life-giving for sure. So speaking of next year, 2021, this year, 2020, has been really challenging is an understatement when I
Yeah.
think about the totality of a global pandemic, raging fires, hurricane season for my peeps in the Southeast and in the Caribbean, protests from coast to coast against police brutality. I feel like democracy is almost like becoming out of reach with a whole
Mhm.
host of factors. And so I'm wondering if within all of that chaos and challenge, if there's been a moment of reckoning for you that you would lift up related to this year.
Sure. So I would say for me, when I think kind of about like my own practice towards freedom and like what does it mean for me to kind of move towards building the world that we want, I go and listen to Black trans women, right? Like I'm like that's very much a part, I think, of my practice and how I do my work. And so I had the opportunity to interview Elle Hearns of the Marsha P. Johnson Institute a few months ago. It feels like years ago now because we're in a pandemic. And one of the things she said to me has really stuck with me. And she said, Black folks have always been going through multiple pandemics, right? And that
Mm,
hit me. It hit me hard because it does feel like in this particular moment, there's like this convergence that's happening, right? That feels particularly poignant and hard. And I also have to hold the reality that for so many of us, we've been experiencing multiple pandemics our entire lifetimes, right? And I think we can talk about the ways, particularly class, as a kind of mirrored some of us to some of the harsher impacts of those
mm,
pandemics. And I think that's something that is important for us as Black folks, and particularly as Black women, to have a frank and open conversation about, right? Um, because for me, then the question becomes like, why is this an emergency right now? It was already an emergency for my Black trans sisters. It was an emergency for undocumented folks, right? We had already had these pandemics all along, but only in 2020, when it hit me in this way, has it felt so painful, right? And I think that speaks to kind of like, what does my allyship look like? Um,
mm,
Also, how do I create comfort for the people that I love? And then also then how do I root myself more deeply in how I show up for the folks who have already been experiencing all of these warning signs that we've been seeing all along. And because of my own privilege, I can only speak for myself, like I just kind of didn't acknowledge or feel in that same visceral way that I'm feeling it right now.
mm. Yeah, I think the depth of feelings and emotions and the weathering and just actually being able to sit with, I guess, the somatics of this experience. I feel like my continuum or threshold for just doing life has stretched and been, and I don't have the right metaphor, um, but it's just been like maybe a period of refinement when I
Yeah.
think about how diamonds are created, or like this feels like a pressure cooker type of test in every aspect, every corner of my life, even to the point where I'm thinking about all of the things that I took for granted by default, yet now I'm interrogating and asking, but why?
Yeah.
So when I think about the protest, for example, and this call for reimagining policing,
Mm-hmm.
there's like this whole history lesson and like design principles that build up that institution of policing that I never considered, conceptualized, even thought about until there was more discourse about defunding the police and what that would actually look like and what that would mean, and how, you know, how much better it could be for communities to invest in healthcare workers or social workers who are, or therapists who are actually going to help intervene and intercede when there is an issue to address, instead of armed people. It's just, there's things that I didn't conceive of prior to this current moment, where now I feel like there's an awakening of interrogate your world, Makia, interrogate everything, which is burdensome and also somewhat liberatory, I think.
It's really beautiful, right? It makes me think of like an essay that Arundhati Roy wrote, like I think in April, where she said the pandemic is a portal, right? And it does, like I feel like there's this invitation for us to kind of reimagine all of these things that we've just accepted as this is the way it is, this is how it's going to be, right? And I think that's actually a function of oppression, right? Is that it's so normalized, like the trauma that we live with from day to day around racism and homophobia and transphobia and xenophobia, right? Like we just accept it as normal, because we've never been asked to envision a different way of living, right? And I even remember kind of reading an essay by someone in the disability movement talking about look at how quickly we transition to virtual interfaces and settings that like invite so many more folks into the room that you said could never be, right? And when I say you, I'm talking about like, you know, these like bigger systems. And it really made me kind of sit back and think like, what have I refused to acknowledge as a possibility because I was taught it as opposed to experienced it, right? So I love what you said about like just kind of seeing this as an invitation.
Yeah, it's definitely that. I hope that others, given that we are this, you know, one world, I do hope that others are also seeing it as an invitation to reflect and reimagine. Though I know there's a continuum in that respect. You mentioned a couple of things earlier on about your freedom practice or your liberation practice. And I'm curious about how that relates to your approach to self-care, if it does, and if there's certain rituals or practices that you employ in order to stay whole.
Yeah. So I think a big part of my freedom practice is I love being around people. And so obviously the pandemic has kind of shifted how we're around people. So for a while, I had a group of folks that like we would get together once a week via Zoom and just look at each other, right? And just, you know, talk and just be together. You know, there's been murder mystery parties. And I'll acknowledge, like, there's always that moment because I think we spend so much of our lives right now in front of screens and laptops that it can just feel exhausting to even get myself there. But I find, like, when I finally get there, you know, so this weekend my partner and I went to a baby shower for a friend of ours via Zoom. And it took so long for me just to even get myself in front of the laptop. But when I was there, I was like, I get to celebrate this family. Even in the midst of this pandemic, I get to celebrate the fact that they're bringing another life in the world. And I would say another really huge thing is writing. You know, I've been a poet since my grandmother told me I was one and a genius. And I can't speak to the genius piece so much, but what I can say is that having a way to kind of write and document what I'm seeing and like think about our world and how I want to communicate has been a lifesaver for me. Because one, it just helps me know where I am and locate myself. And then it also helps me put it somewhere and move it if it needs to be moved, right?
Sounds cathartic.
It definitely is. Yeah. And I think also too, one of the things I find so often about being a Black woman is that so often we question our ability to be cultural creators, like when that's all we do. Whether or not we're talking about Black Twitter or National Do-Rag Appreciation Day, or all of the movements that have like sparked online and the way that Black folks have curated that, it's really this like magical and exciting thing, right? But I think oftentimes in mainstream discourse, it's derided, it's not seen as valuable or necessary, when I would argue it's actually a cultural tradition. It's a cultural practice of us learning and moving together, right? And so for me, I think part of that work it's not just always about, it's not just catharsis, even though it is, but it's also this practice of like me naming for myself that my voice is valuable in this.
Mm. I'm currently finishing up Michelle Obama's Becoming. I'm tardy to the party on that.
I haven't read it yet, so you're ahead of me.
Okay, there's so many great books. I just picked up Alicia Garza's this week too, and so there's so many books that I've been devouring during the pandemic. But there's an element in Michelle Obama's piece about finding her voice and realizing that she needs to tell her own story so no one else can co-opt it or tell it for her. And so I think the power of voice is really critical. And there's so many messages that we receive, specifically as Black women, about kind of like shrinking or tone or making ourselves smaller, keeping people comfortable. And it's really, I don't know, you've just inspired me with what you shared about your writing process and your creative process. And it's almost a reminder to me about the being able to curate content and being like leveraging my creative genius in different and unique ways, because like the world needs it.
Yeah, we need it. I agree wholeheartedly.
Perfect. So the world also needs some advice from you, Saida. And so as I think about the Black women that follow Black and Bold and others as well, I'm curious about what advice you would offer other Black women who are trying to develop or amplify their voice and become better self-advocates.
Yeah, so it was interesting. So when I saw that question, I thought a lot about the advice that had been given to me by my mentors in my life and how valuable it is. And if I was to distill down like what I've learned in my 20 plus years of working now, I would say one, for me, it's just about kind of knowing what your boundaries are and knowing the gifts that you bring, right? And not questioning that. Right. That's not to say you're not going to be open to feedback or any type of conversation around maybe about things that might need to shift. But I think what you need to kind of be or have an irrevocable sense of is the gifts that you bring into any space that you enter. Right. Because I think so often, particularly as Black women, we face misogynoir, we face kind of this intense racism and this desire for us to kind of cut ourselves down to something that feels palatable and less threatening to the people around us. And, the models, when I think about my models or role models for my work, it's always the women who are unapologetic in their brilliance. And so, not to say that we don't have to shift or code switch because we don't live in that beautiful liberatory world yet. But I think part of practicing our freedom is knowing for ourselves, like, this is what I absolutely will not step down on. This is what I will refuse to move on and be good in that, be okay in that. And yes, there's a risk involved. And sometimes, that's a whole different conversation about the risks that is involved in being yourself. But I think the world needs more unapologetic Black women.
You had me transported to Wakanda momentarily. That's right, Wakanda forever. So my final question for you is related to the broader social sector. So I just asked you about advice specific to Black women and how we show up and navigate and really take up space unapologetically. I'm curious, since we are operating in a larger ecosystem or environment, if you could change the social sector in a way that would benefit or affirm Black women, what would that change be?
I think that would mean that the folks who say that they're allies are doing the work of really being allies. You know, so one thing that I was thinking of today, you know, as we talked about, there was a Black man that was just killed in Philadelphia by the police in front of his mother. And it brought me back to this moment where, oh gosh, I was believing like 2015, 2014. It was right after the Tamir Rice case was dismissed, right? And then the Pulse shootings happened. And so I remember, so I worked at an LGBTQ org at the time, and I was like their director of community engagement and public policy. And I remember kind of crying in my office when I heard about the Tamir Rice case. And, you know, no one knew what to say to me. I was the only Black person who worked in my organization. It's predominantly white folks. And then when Pulse happened, it felt like everyone was there and grieving, right? Which made sense. But what I kept thinking about was that they didn't see me, right? I'm here as a Black queer woman. I was grieving for everyone who was impacted by Pulse, but yet when it was Tamir or the many other Black folks, queer, trans, cis that came before, their lives didn't have the same resonance, right? And so I remember just bawling in the middle of the meeting and just saying like, why? I just kept repeating like, why don't you see me? Why don't you see me? Because they were in the midst of like figuring out like a strategy to kind of respond to Pulse and figure out all these other things. But I was like, there wasn't the same urgency, right? And so I think the work for the social sector as a whole is asking why, asking where is that resonance, where is that urgency for Black and Brown folks, and how are we practicing that urgency, and how are we deferring to the leadership, particularly of Black and Brown trans women in our work, and how are we uplifting that, and what practices do we have that bring us towards liberation, and what are the practices that we have that are actually taking us away from that. And that's like, I mean, that would be my dream. I want that to happen. I think we need that to happen for our own humanity.
That comment reminds me of maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago. I heard TD Jakes on a podcast with Katie Couric and Bozoma St. John. And there was a quote where he mentioned, it was basically a call to action, but it wasn't about like, I need you to say Black Lives Matter. It's like, I need you to see our humanity.
Yeah.
And so it's just stuck with me. And I think to your point that there's certain dimensions of people's identities that might be more dominant for how they're experiencing the world. But that really resonates with me that your grief was almost like invisible when it was related to Tamir Rice, you know, a young Black kid playing in a park. And that the response was so drastically different related to Pulse, that I think that's something to just sit with. I mean, for the people that you were working with and for others that are trying to think about, how can I be an ally? How can I be a co-conspirator? Like, there's so many words, and I just want the words to actually be action. Like, I don't want you to tell me what book you read. I want you to demonstrate to me that you see my humanity and the fullness of my humanity and the fullness of the humanity of people who look like me, versus kind of telling me the academic pieces where, you know, I now know the definition from How to Be an Anti-Racist because I read that book. It's like, that's the bottom of the ladder for trying to actually like get to liberation and get to building a world that works for the collective. And so I think that's a really poignant example. And I can think of my own examples that are in that same vein.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that makes it hard, right? Like, you know, when we talk about like moving together, because I love that job. I can tell you, right? I love that job down. Like it felt like home, like working with like queer and trans and non-binary people, and like us being in movement together. And like, to me, I mean, these movements are all interlocked, right? Like, how could they not be, you know? But it was a moment where I felt so intensely alone, right? And I
Mhm.
think we all have, as Black women, we all have those moments, right? Or days or months or whatever, right? And I think so much about kind of the virtue signaling that happens, right? Like, so, you know, someone will be like, I had a white friend who was posting online and talking about like, hey, like they weren't talking to me, fortunately, but they were like, hey, my white friends, like, it's not just about posting, you know, that black square or saying Black Lives Matter. Like, it's about, as you said, it's about, you know, what is your lifelong commitment to undoing racism? What does that look like for you? You know, and it's heavy work, and there's all a role that we have to play. Um, I'm asking for my allies and my co-conspirators to do that work.
Mm. I will continue to ask mine to do it as well. I feel like this conversation with you has been illuminating and a source of light at the start of my week. So thank you so much for making time to share your gems and your Black girl magic with the Black and Bold community.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, and thank you for creating this space. I think it's so necessary.